everybody. I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, August 28th, 2023. Hope you're doing well. I am super excited to let you know that my new book, Camping with Kierkegaard, Faithfulness as a Way of Life, will be available to buy on Amazon this Friday, September the 1st. So please pick up a copy, leave a good review on Amazon and Goodreads, and reach out to me so we can think together about the ideas in it. Today, I wanted to think about basically a big principle that the book invites us to reflect upon, and that is the idea of doing philosophy in the wild. Now, the book could have been titled Philosophy in the Wild, but I kind of liked the alliteration of Camping with Kierkegaard, and so went with that. But why is it we should do philosophy in the wild? And what do we even mean by the wild, such that it's a place we could seek out? Let me suggest that the idea of doing philosophy in the wild does not necessarily mean going to rivers like the one that I'm sitting by now. It doesn't mean getting away to the mountains. It doesn't mean going to some island. It doesn't mean getting to the beach. It's simply an idea of breaking free from the general assumptions that dictate the norms of our everyday life. So by wild, I simply mean the non-cultivated. This can happen in all sorts of ways, but it is an intentional disruption of our ordinary. Now, the reason we should do this, it seems, is because, as Martin Heidegger suggests, when we interrogate what we inherit as obvious, it invites us to live more reflectively and be purposive about stuff we would otherwise ignore. That which is obvious, says David Foster Wallace, is that which usually is of life and death significance, and yet the most underappreciated facets of our existence. It's what we take for granted. It's what we move past. It's obvious after all, so why pay attention? When we get to the wild, when we change our location in order to think differently, it disrupts our assumptions. It disrupts what we normally would fall into. The habits, practices, behaviors, the very speed and flow of life gets the opportunity to be reset. So let me suggest 3 reasons why I think getting to the wild in order to do this reset is actually really important. Now remember, it doesn't mean actually taking a vacation, going somewhere else. Maybe it just means getting coffee at a different coffee shop this morning. Maybe it means trying a donut instead of a bagel. Maybe it simply means watching a different channel. The idea is simply that when we interrupt what we do so often, we now have opportunities to think differently about who we are, where we are, and why it matters. So 3 ideas maybe for getting into the wild. First, getting into the wild allows us to break free of the crowd, or the herd, or the they. This is what Kierkegaard recommends when he says, I could not think here in the city, so I had to take a journey. This is why Nietzsche suggests that philosophers need long legs so that they can get away from the crowd, the herd down in the cities and move to the mountaintops. The crowd is basically the idea that we tend to think like others, just to accept what they recommend, how they view the world. And the problem with this is that it lets things seem obvious when they need to be understood as contingent. So when we break free from the crowd mentality, it allows us to figure out what we believe and why we believe it. It lets us invite ourselves, as Whitman would say. We invite our soul to think differently about what is thinkable, rather than just to find ourselves flowing with the current, going with the herd. We can actually intend our footsteps, move on purpose. So we go to the wild, we do philosophy in the wild first in order to escape the crowd. And when we escape the crowd, what's so compelling is it invites us, number 2, to develop self-trust. Emerson and Thoreau were big fans of doing philosophy in the wild. In fact, Thoreau says that he goes to the woods to live intentionally. Emerson says that we should invest in self-reliance as a good for our lives. All of this, I think, is about developing self-trust. When we have to rely on ourselves, when we can't just fall into the ordinary pace of the crowd, we learn that we have to believe what is worth believing. When we can no longer simply move according to the pacing of the crowd, we develop a self-trust because we've got to decide that what we do is worth doing. We have to believe that our own views about the world are worth holding, that our actions are in fact truth-seeking and virtuous. Now, we could be wrong about this. Self-trust is not an infallible certainty about our own views. It's instead a way of sort of resting easy in our own voice. And sometimes we need to escape the crowd to be able to hear ourselves think, to find our voice. And when we find that voice, trust becomes possible. Linda Zagzebski says that self-trust is the condition of trusting others, and I think she's right. So none of this is about escaping other people to invest in our libertarian egoism. It's about escaping the crowd mentality so that our own ideas can be trustworthy, and we develop the skill to lean into that. And number 3, we go to the wild to do philosophy because it allows us to develop a different way of listening. In other words, when we're in the wild, we hear things that we would otherwise miss when surrounded by cars and horns and the noise of our everyday life. Right now, I can hear the river behind me. I can hear the crickets chirping. And if I go just a few hundred yards away, it turns out I'm right near a road, and then everything changes. The sounds change. Now, why is this important? Because when we learn to hear differently, when we learn to be attuned to our environment and realize that our environment can change, I think this actually develops in us a mode of being invested more intentionally also in that which surrounds us. This is important for when we go back to our everyday life, when we go back to the cultivated realities that define our existence, because now we learn to listen differently to others, to listen differently to possibilities that confront us in our everyday decision making. We learn to develop the ears to hear the contingency of what we tend to narrate as the real world. When we understand that the real world could be different, precisely because the wild shows us a different way of living, we are better able to then navigate the world where we are as one that could be otherwise. Are we happy with who we are, how we are, and where we are? Then great. If not, we can change it. So those ideas, going to the wild in order to escape the crowd, to learn to think differently about who we are, so that we can develop self-trust and learn that our voice is worthwhile, so that we can then listen more effectively to what surrounds us, to empathetically relate to others and new possibilities. These 3 ideas are at the core of why I recommend doing philosophy in the wild. Now, you can do it in the mountains and take your mountain bike and your fishing rod. Those are the sorts of activities that I reflect on in Camping with Kierkegaard. But the big idea is not that you should do what I do, but that we all should do on purpose a little bit of distancing from the everyday in order to get more compelling in how we live here and now. Thank you again for watching. Pick up a copy of Camping with Kierkegaard as soon as it is out, September 1st, this Friday. And I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.